All right, tonight we are going to deal with the problem of evil, which I've been promising you for some time we would do. This topic probably by itself would be sufficient for an entire course. So it's a bit of a problem to determine what to select. I mean, I do not know whether we'll do this in one class or two. Obviously, you have to be selective as to how deeply you want to go into it and what parts you want to cover. Some of it presupposes material that we have covered in prior classes, but I'll try not to do that too much so that we can treat it pretty much as an independent topic. We will presuppose that we have developed the concept of God, which we have done in the last several classes, which we have demonstrated in the last several classes, demonstrating that God exists, demonstrating some of the divine attributes, and particularly the ones that we are concerned about in this class with respect to the problem of evil are the divine attributes of omnipotence, that God is all-powerful, and that God is all good. So I'm sure you probably know, if you've ever done a web search for atheism, that the atheists' number one argument against the existence of God is the problem of evil. In fact, it's sometimes their number 1 through 10 argument against the existence of God. I find most of the other objections that they raise are the kind which I've mentioned to you before one would expect from college sophomores. They're not well done. They're misconceptions of the nature of God, which lead them to think that God is somehow self-contradictory. And again, as you know, in the last couple classes, we've spent some time addressing those kinds of issues and sought to show that the concept of God is not only not contradictory, but amazingly coherent and consistent. The other basis for atheism is really not so much a matter of atheism as a kind of agnosticism, namely a denial of the ability of the human mind to conclude that God exists. But that, of course, is not atheism. In some instances, you will see attacks upon proofs for God's existence. Usually, these are based upon the assumption of the Kantian description of the arguments for God, not the Thomistic ones, so that the objections that are leveled are really ones that are appropriate within the Kantian context and do not address those of St. Thomas. But in any event, these are simply attacks upon the ability to demonstrate the existence of God. Our starting point tonight is the concept of God in relation to the question of the existence of evil. Sometimes I've told students in the past, it depends on where you start. I dare say if you start with the problem of evil, you'll probably never get to God. I could well imagine that a person beginning with the problem of evil who isn't familiar with how to demonstrate the existence of God, they'll never get there. Ours is not that plight, though, because we have already demonstrated the existence of God and his nature. So it makes a difference. What we are doing is starting with the fact of God's existence and of his omnipotence and his goodness, and trying to, in light of that, understand the problem of evil. So it really does make a difference which end of the stick you start with. I'm not saying that it's impossible to begin with evil, but I'm saying that it's much more difficult, and those who are the atheists that are utterly immersed in this problem, really are not prepared intellectually to follow the kind of journey that would lead them to concluding that God exists and is all good and all powerful. Having said that, let's begin with what is known as the classic expression of the problem of evil in a sense, and that is Voltaire's Candide, which was written very hastily after a major earthquake in Lisbon, which resulted in the death of several thousand people, and this caused Voltaire to quickly write this book, which is considered something of a literary classic. It's rather prurient in its content, but the theme is very easily understood. Candide is the hero of the book, and he sets out for all sorts of adventures. And he has this good friend Pangloss, who's telling him that this is the best of all possible worlds, and whatever happens, happens for the best, which is a parody of, I believe it's Leibniz. I was going to say Nietzsche, but obviously that's the wrong century. Yeah, it's Leibniz's concept. And so, anyway, Candide goes through every possible misdeed. His ship sinks, he's thrown into prison, he's beaten upon, robbed, you name it. But whatever happens, Pangloss is always there quoting Leibniz. This is the best of all possible worlds, and whatever happens, happens for the best. And it doesn't take very long to get the point that Voltaire's trying to make, that maybe this isn't the best of all possible worlds, and that what happens doesn't happen for the best. Now, Voltaire is playing the cynic's game here, but it's an old objection. It's one going back at least to Epicurus. And its essence is very simple. The existence of evil in the world leaves us with a problem. How is it, if God is said to be all-powerful and all good, why is there evil in the world? Either he is all-powerful and could therefore prevent the evil, but doesn't will to do so, in which case he's not good. Or else, if he's all good, he appears to be impotent to stop the evil. If he is all powerful and all good, then why is there evil? This goes back to Epicurus. It's repeated multiple times down through history, from really the mouth of virtually every atheist we've ever seen, not the least of which would be John Stuart Mill. How does one approach this problem? Where do you begin to try to resolve it? And by the way, it's at two different levels. One we call the natural evil. This would be things like hurricanes, tornadoes, diseases, earthquakes, all the things that happen in the world that we really have no control over for the most part. And then we have moral evils, murder, rape, theft, warfare, and so forth. Why do each of these exist? And one has to bear in mind that when we look at the world beneath the level of mankind, in the animal kingdom, it's really not love thy neighbor, but eat thy neighbor. At the microscopic and animalistic level of the world, it seems to be a world of nothing but pain and suffering and tooth and claw. It's really a very ugly scene, especially if you look at it in some detail. And one asks, why would God make a world like this? And one might say, well, this was introduced with original sin, and some do make this argument, but in a more conventional chronology, it appears that original sin, or at least it can be argued that original sin occurred after the existence of the animal kingdom, in which there was a lot of chewing and chasing and murdering taking place. Of course, they don't murder, but killing. So one asks then, how does this relate to something that we might have done or might not have done? It's certainly not an easy problem to resolve, and obviously the arguments have gone on forever. The classical answer to the objection is made by St. Augustine and repeated by St. Thomas Aquinas. When St. Thomas raises one of the two objections to the proofs for God's existence in the Summa Theologiae, Book 1, Question 2, Article 3, the objection he raises is the problem of evil. And the answer which he gives, he cites Augustine, very simply, that God permits evil and would not permit an evil unless some good be drawn from it. And one might argue, indeed, that perhaps God permits evil so as to permit a greater good to occur than would otherwise be possible. But of course, how do we show this? How do we show that indeed it had to be this way? If you look at the notes that I had sent out to you, I don't know how many of you have them with you, but one way we can divide the problem of evil is by looking at those things. This isn't in your notes, I just realized it's in my notes, not yours. Sorry. But you can look at those things which occur below the level of man or below the level of free beings, and then consider the level of man, the level of free beings. In other words, let's consider evil starting with the very lowest of things, those that are not even alive, if you will. And bearing in mind, just to reprise some things we did in a previous class, we have to remember that evil is not a thing. Evil is not a substance. Evil is the lack of a due perfection. So when you're suffering a disease, what you're exhibiting is a lack of health. If you are looking at blindness in a horse, it's the lack of something the horse ought to have. So bearing that in mind, let's start down at the very bottom and ask ourselves how evil relates to being, because as we mentioned in the previous class, being and goodness are really identical. They're transcendentals. They are simply different ways of looking at the same thing. Being is simply being, considered in itself and looked at positively. Goodness is goodness is being from the standpoint of desirability. So being and goodness are the same thing. Things are therefore basically good. From the standpoint of Aquinas' metaphysics, if God is infinitely good, then whatever he makes must be good. And when he gives things their natures, that whatever nature he gives them, that is the perfection of their being. And the evil is found in them only to the extent that they don't live up to that nature, that there's something defective in that nature. They ought to be healthy, but they're diseased. They ought to be virtuous, but they're vicious. They're lacking the proper order to nature, which would be the perfection of their being. So from a metaphysical standpoint, we really have a basically good world, a positive world, in which the infinitely good God creates finite beings, yes, but beings that are in their own order good. Some have argued, for example, that evil is necessary because anything less than God is finite, and to the extent it's not God, it is somehow therefore defective and therefore evil. But this is to misunderstand the nature of good and evil. Finite beings are not evil. Finite beings are good because they are being. They possess whatever quality of existence belongs to their nature. Evil exists only when they are defective in relation to that nature. So it's not as though God is the only good being and everything else is evil. No, God is good. What he makes is good, but evil arises within those things that he makes because things become defective in some way or other. We still have the problem of explaining how they get defective, why they get defective, but at least we can begin to look at this with a metaphysical perspective, which is not present to the atheistic materialist, mind you. All they tend to see is the pain and suffering and disorder that exists in the world, but they don't have a metaphysical framework in which to begin to approach it from the other end. That's why I say it makes a big difference where you start with the problem. If you start with nothing but the problem, you're going to have a hard time finding the solution. It's like trying to find true religion by picking on all of its defects. That isn't the way that one goes about doing it. You have to go about doing it in a positive way by trying to determine the truth and then deal with objections that may be raised once you have found what you are looking for. But as I said, let's start at the bottom. Let's start at the bottom. I'm going to show you something right now which is really terribly evil. I know it won't record well, so I'll describe it. But you see, I hold my finger up here. Now, watch this. This is really bad. I don't know if you're old enough to see this, but watch what I do. Here, see. Did you see that? I bent my finger over to a right angle. Wasn't that horrible? Because you see, in doing that, I destroyed the perfection of its straightness. Did that, didn't I?
Well, there's a law against
Yeah,
that.
or should be. But you see, the point is, if I'm going to have a finger, it needs to be able to bend. If God is going to make a world of physical beings, they have to be subject to motion. They have to be subject to change. For them, that is appropriate to their nature. Now, it's not, of course, a real evil to bend your finger, because you're not losing a due perfection. It isn't due to your nature that your finger must be straight. And if it were, I'd say you have a bad case of arthritis. So, if we look at the physical world, and by the way, I've never seen anybody say, the reason I'm an atheist is because of all those inanimate objects out there that are subject to change. They don't say that. And if you stop and think about it, I'll tell you some real evil. You know, go down to a rock quarry where they're smashing rocks together and breaking them all up. Isn't that horrible? Do you know anybody who declares that he's an atheist because of what's happening in a rock quarry? And yet, of course, that is the destruction of the perfection of the unity of those rocks. But it also belongs to their nature to be subject to such corruption. See, if you're going to be completely logical about evil, you have to consider it at every level, and I want you to begin to notice something about the nature of the atheist argument. It isn't quite universal. Nobody gets upset about all of the horrible things that happen in a volcano. They might be upset about what the volcano does to people, but a volcano is a very violent place. And nobody says I'm an atheist because volcanoes exist. But let's move it up to the vegetative kingdom. Now we're dealing with things that are alive and have terrible evil in the order of these poor vegetative entities. Have you ever considered what happens when you make and eat a salad? Do you ever consider the fact that you're eating the salad alive? As a matter of fact, this is demonstrable because when you're making the salad and you pull up a leaf of lettuce and you look at it and you say, oh, this one doesn't go in, it's dead. You throw it away. You want only the ones that are alive so you can eat them alive. And again, curiously, I have never heard an atheist say, the reason that I'm an atheist is because of what's going on in that fruit bar over there, that salad bar. They never say that. And yet, if you look at it from the standpoint of the problem of evil, that is real evil for those poor little vegetables. They're getting all ground up and chopped up, and you're eating them alive. Well, I know, you say, well, this is not being real about the whole thing. Let's get up to the animal kingdom, all right? Because there we do have pain and suffering. Okay. Let's look at the problem at the level of the animal kingdom. Well, there's a couple tacks one could take here. What are we really concerned with? If you're not worried about the vegetables being eaten, you shouldn't care about the animals being eaten. You say, but the animals suffer. Ah, do they suffer? I'm just going to play devil's advocate here for a minute. How do you know they suffer? How can you demonstrate that they're suffering?
They live.
Well, I know, you'd say, well, they yell, they object, they scream, and somebody would say that one could perhaps attach them to an electroencephalograph. I think they did this with grass some years ago. They hooked these things up some out of grass, and they showed that if you approached it with the shears, that they get all excited, all upset as they're about to be beheaded. Think what massive terror must exist on lawn mowing day. But you see, that presupposes some things. How do I know that another animal is suffering? By the way they react? How do I know when you tell me that you're suffering? How do I know that you are in fact experiencing what you tell me? Much less an animal. Now you say, well, they've got a nervous system. Okay, we have a nervous system, and if we jolt ourselves with electricity, it hurts. So if you jolt an animal with electricity, it must hurt. But notice that's an argument from analogy. What we know is that you get a reaction from the animal. We know that you get a scream. We know that you get some kind of a nervous response. But what science cannot detect is the subjective experience of pain. Well, you tell me it really hurts when somebody pulls your tooth. Okay, well, maybe it does, but maybe you're a crybaby. Maybe you're just telling me this. In other words, how do we know that the animals are experiencing anything, for that matter, or anything like what we experience? Conversely, if God is going to make animals which are capable of sense knowledge and can move towards a sensible good because it's attractive and desirable and gives pleasure as a reward, it would equally suit the purpose of the animal to be turning away from something that would be harmful. So it seeks food or sex as a good for the individual or the species and is attracted by the pleasure attendant thereto. Similarly, it resists those things that are harmful to the individual or perhaps to their offspring, because that's good for the individual or the species, and of course it has to have some sense of a deterrence in terms of something that is displeasurable. So we can see the function of pain in the animal kingdom. First, I would argue it's a little bit of a problem to prove that they even have pain, but if you grant that they do have pain, then you can make sense of it being good for the animal kingdom to have this, be for the individual and for the species. So, it depends on which way you want to go with the argument. And you could even argue that even if they're not feeling it, you could have kind of a built-in program for a greater reaction to a greater sensible evil. You can argue for the need for pain to be greater or less, so that little tiger cubs, when they're practicing their biting skills on their siblings, they don't kill them, and they're able to tell the difference between just a playful bite and a death grasp. See? They've got to be able to tell the difference in the degree of pain in order to know how to respond. So that would argue either for just differences in reaction without pain, or for difference in painful reactions. either way. But if, again, we have a problem, it's kind of stepping back to God. If God's going to make a world of physical beings, they've got to be subject to the clashes which rocks have when they bang together. And if God's going to make a world of vegetative beings, then they are going to be subject to the possibility that they be eaten by animals if there are animals around. And if God's going to make animal beings, then we have to expect that it's possible that they are going to experience pain as something that is appropriate to that kind of a being. Because remember, animals are sentient organisms. They sense, they experience. They experience objects through sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. And we don't normally think of it so much in terms of smell, but it's the same kind of thing. You smell something that smells good, you're attracted to it. You smell something that's rotten, well, this is not a pleasant experience, and it warns an animal not to eat something that would be poisonous. So again, if God's going to make those kinds of beings, then the presence of sensible evil and sensible good makes sense. Now that's not to say that it's a complete end of the story, because we haven't gotten up to human beings yet. We haven't considered the difference that arises when you're dealing with human beings as opposed to other animals. But at least I want you to notice that people don't say that they're atheists because of what happens to rocks or vegetables, or for that matter, I've never heard them say, I'm an atheist because of what raid did to all of my cockroaches last night. In fact, they tend to be rather gleeful at the thought of what raid does. As a matter of fact, we're rather selective. You may recall, was it 30 years ago now, when they were getting all upset about the baby seals, and they're having, because they were going up there and whacking them and killing them in a most bloody way. I don't know why, I don't remember why, but anyway, these eco-friendly groups were getting really excited about it and upset and saying what a terrible thing. And yet I always thought it amusing that I could well imagine one of these groups, Greenpeace or somebody, getting together in Chicago and protesting what was happening to the baby seals, and then they say, oh, it's noon, let's go down to McDonald's for some hamburgers. As everybody knows, hamburgers come from hamburger heaven, right? But there's a certain kind of selectivity here. I just want you to notice that atheists usually don't say, I'm an atheist because hamburgers exist. There's something about the idea, and even many of them would say, well, it's good to thin the flock of a herd if it's too thick. But they get very upset about what might happen to their own pet pooch. And of course, they could get very upset about what might happen to somebody they know. It's easier not to be upset about things that happen to someone you don't know. Now, what I begin to detect here, I begin to suspect that what we're looking at is a certain myopic view that's really evaluating the values of what is important enough to reject God in terms of things that are happening in the atheist's own realm, the things that are really close, perhaps his own life. And by the way, don't always take seriously what an atheist tells you as to why they're an atheist. I had a friend at the University of Detroit for a couple of years who was an atheist and giving all kinds of arguments against God. And then one night he said to me, someday maybe I'll tell you why I really am an atheist. Which of course left me wondering, what had he been telling me for 2 years? Problem is to get to the real reasons, because the real reasons sometimes are personal and psychological, as much as they appear to be metaphysical or philosophical. But I just want you to notice that the objections that are raised are not focused on a purely metaphysical plane. Otherwise, they ought to be saying they're atheists because of how hard it is to be a carrot or a rutabaga. And I don't hear people saying that. They get very concerned about the things that happen around them, around their world. And indeed, one can get very upset about somebody else's pain and suffering. But sometimes that's because it's difficult to get your own psyche out of their position, and therefore you're kind of suffering with them, whether you like it or not. But anyway, there are many ways you could approach these issues. Let's get up to man. Let's get up to where most people are really concerned. And indeed, when you talk about man, our ability to suffer seems to far exceed that of an animal. Animals do not possess certain qualities we do. For example, I want you to think about the last time that you went to the dentist. And let's say you had a molar, upper molar that had a really deep cavity. And I guess they don't do this so much anymore, but you remember when they used to use these old drills that ran on these pulleys, and they had big burrs on them, and you may have had your dentist going right up to the pit of that filling, or that cavity, and just when he gets up to the almost to the root, you know how those things, they would go about 10,000 or maybe 700 RPM, very slow, a lot of vibration. And just as he's getting up there, sometimes he gets stuck, that gets jammed and stops. And sometimes he's getting up so high you think he's going to come right out through your eyeball. Now, I submit to you, I probably have just induced a certain degree of psychic pain just by describing what I did. Were you a bunch of chimpanzees, I don't think it would have bothered you in the least. And that, of course, highlights the difference between lower animals and man. We are the only ones that run around fearing dying. We are the only ones that have this capacity of empathy for others, this ability to imagine how bad something is to the point that it drives us crazy. I'm not saying your pet pooch doesn't have a bad dream now and then. Is that there is a certain carryover, but they're not living in the past, in the agony of the past, as some of us are, and they're not living in the agony of anticipating the future, as many of us do. That's a peculiarly human experience. Human beings are capable of suffering in an exquisite manner, in ways that no animal really ever could. As far as animals are concerned, for the most part, all they're doing is going through life, experiencing pleasure until, boom, they get swallowed by something, even if it's pretty brief. I'm not saying they don't get caught in traps and so forth. We know that argument, but by and large, their life is not one of anticipating death or agony or terror or mental suffering, but simply just doing. You can't imagine what it is to be an animal. That's one of the problems you have. We're always committing this fallacy of anthropomorphism and putting ourselves in the place of the animal and saying, if I was an animal, this is what I'd be thinking if this was happening to me. Well, you're not, and it isn't. It just isn't that way. The closest you can come to knowing what a purely animal response is, and I gave you this one before, is if you put your hand on a red hot electric stove, and for the moment that it sticks to the stove and you yank it back because of a reflex, it just goes through your back, and you don't even realize you've done it. That's the animal response. By the time you pick it up and look at it and realize that your flesh is still on the burner, that's already in the human domain. You're reflecting on it. You're aware of what's happening to you. The animal simply has that initial brute experience, which we can have, but the moment we notice we're having it, we're reflecting on it, we're doing something human. You can't stop being human, and you need to stop imposing your humanity on things that are not human. As hard as it is to imagine, this is one of the problems that animal psychologists have. They invariably commit the fallacy of anthropomorphism. They can't stop themselves. People like Jane Goodall run around thinking that the monkeys are telling stories that are making them laugh. And, if I lived with chimps as long as she did, I probably would start thinking that too. But coming up to the human level, when you get to the human level, you're dealing with creatures with free will. It's a different dimension. See, that's not below the level of free beings. That's not natural evil. That's below. That's now we're up to the level where we have free choice, and we can bring our own evil upon ourselves. We don't need God to do it. But again, there's a lot of aspects that we have to keep in mind here. Again, just to come back to the physical for a moment, if you think about God making the world, we might say, well, why are there things like hurricanes? Well, one of the reasons there's hurricanes is if you're going to have a physical world, if we're going to have planets in that physical world, planets have to rotate. And if they're going to rotate, they got to go at the right speed. If they go any fast, if the Earth went any faster than it does, we'd have endless, uncontrollable hurricanes because the wind patterns are part of a product of the Earth rotating. If it went any faster, we'd have even more violent weather. If it went any slower, we'd bake and freeze. See, you got to have the right rotational speed. So there are certain laws inherent in the logic of making a physical world. But at any rate, let's come down to the next paragraph here. And again, we're kind of entering this from multiple levels. First of all, some people would say that as far as the world is concerned, evil is something purely imaginary. And that is certainly not the Thomistic position. Evil is something real. It's not simply non-being. It is non-being in the sense of something lacking and something that ought to have it. If you don't understand the proper definition of evil, you've got no way of comprehending why it's here. Evil is not just nothing. Evil must always be understood in relationship to a nature. And the natures as such are bundles of capacities of activity and perfection. And each thing is seeking its own good. There's nothing wrong with that. If we get eaten by a shark, isn't that horrible? The shark's just getting his lunch. We don't like what's on the menu. See, that highlights another point that we often kind of miss. When we talk about good and evil, we usually mean good for us and evil to us. We're not really thinking of it in an abstract, universal way. Indeed, below man in the animal kingdom, the law of the jungle, as I said, is eat thy neighbor, not love thy neighbor. Well, they love to eat their neighbor. But in each case, what you're seeing is an animal engaged in actions designed to perfect itself. Evil arises because of the intersection of two sets of drives. A deer goes down to a spring to get some water, and in the process, some wild animal pounces upon it and devours it. The deer was seeking to get the water. The animal that attacks it was seeking to get the deer. One got what it was seeking, the other didn't. But that is what happens when you have many, many, many different beings that are capable of action and where their activities can intersect in such a way that for some it achieves a good and for others it doesn't. We're not going to say that evil is imaginary. Evil is real. It's a privation of a proper perfection. It is a perversion of nature. Literally, it's a turning away of nature from its end. It's a meaning of perversion. It's a turning away of nature from its end. By definition, God creates all natures. He creates all things in accordance with his own intention. How can he fail? He's God. So the thing's nature are the realization of his intention. You might say, well, not according to Darwinism, it's just, some kind of a blind thing producing stuff that wasn't anticipated. But that doesn't mean it was not anticipated by God, who creates the world in which any supposed evolutionary processes take place. It doesn't escape his omniscience. One of the problems that we have is that we look at the world and we see in it war, famine, strife, suffering, pain, immorality, nastiness of every type. And we quite properly ask, how could God make this world? How could God make all you got to do is watch the evening news and you ask yourself, how could God even permit this, say nothing of create it? How could God make this world? The answer is very simple. He didn't. He didn't, because we're not looking at the world as God created it. Something very funny happened on the way to the forum. What we are looking at is a world not as God created it, but as it has evolved from what God did create. What indeed could go wrong with what God made, and have it not be his fault? There's only one possible way to explain it, and that is what is known as the free will defense. Namely, God must have created some beings that possessed freedom, and they must have misused their freedom. That's the most common objection to or answer to the problem of evil. He must have created the world good, and after he created it, somehow evil was introduced. Not by necessity. If it was by necessity, then you'd blame it on God. In other words, if he made a world good and then it had to become evil, you could properly blame him. But if he made the world good and it became evil because of the exercise of free faculties, that's a different story. Then you could find evil, but it would not necessarily be referable to God. You could ask, why did he make free beings? That's another question, which we will come to. Yes?
How would you explain the tree of good and evil?
The
tree of good and evil.
The tree of good and evil. Frankly, I would prefer not to, because you're dragging up Genesis here, and I'm just doing metaphysics. I'll let a theologian do that. But the general explanation is that God creates free beings, and then he allows the misuse of the perfection of freedom to introduce evil into the world. And the only reason he would do that is because by permitting that to enter the world, some greater good comes about than would otherwise have been possible. Now, of course, you might ask, well, how is that possible? Why couldn't God have just made a world in which nothing would go wrong? Surely that seems possible. But you see, God could do that by not making the kinds of beings in which things can go wrong. What kinds of beings can things go wrong in that are not his fault? Obviously, free beings, intelligent beings, beings with intellect and will. God had an alternative. Don't make them. We wouldn't be here discussing it. Which would we prefer? You can see, I think, the value of the person, the free being, certainly is a greater good than merely the risk that the free being misuse its freedom. Now, of course, if God's going to make free beings, and freedom is not a pure sham, then it has to really be possible that freedom be misused. And if it's really possible, we shouldn't be shocked if it is misused.
Couldn't you say that some evil is not really related to a misuse of, if I happened to trip over
Right.
a purse, it broke my arm,
That-
there was no one's.
That's why we distinguish between natural evil and moral evil. Now the question is, can moral evil introduce natural evil? And there's a couple answers to the natural evil thing. I don't want to forget them before I get to them. Go ahead. You would make me forget it, but that's an evil that just comes.
What about the possibility of choosing between a range of goods?
Well,
Could you be free to
Sure.
choose
Yeah.
between, be truly free by being able to choose?
Sure, we do that all the time. Which candy bar am I going to eat?
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. But also I have the possibility of doing things I shouldn't do, because I have a nature which I may misuse. Dennis?
Buddhists or Eastern philosophies, do they ignore this distinction between moral and physical? Because, I mean, if they say there's no evil or it's just a perception, I mean, I think they want everybody to feel balanced and well, but when evil's out there, it's there.
That
It's
would be attempting to make it illusory, and we're not doing that. I'm granting that it is absolutely real. Now, as far as natural evils, as I mentioned earlier, we got a couple things going on here. One, it looks like those natural evils may well have been around before we were, and you had animals eating animals before we appeared. There's several ways you can go here. One is if you argue that lower nature exists only for the sake of man or spiritual beings, then it would make sense that if God is going to make a world in which man would naturally appear, some of the things that are attendant to that world would exist before he appears. So that you could argue that if God's going to make the kind of world in which we find ourselves, in which it now makes sense that these animals exist and are eating each other and we're still here, then you could argue that the fact they existed before we were here would simply be a necessary natural step in preparing the kind of world in which we find ourselves. As far as us accidentally tripping over things, that again arises if God's going to make this kind of a world. As I said, to have the planet rotating, you got to have it going at a certain speed. Too fast or too slow isn't acceptable, but the speed at which it goes makes hurricanes. And that's somewhat unavoidable. If you want a world in which nothing goes wrong, a physical world, I read an article some years back written by somebody who I think was an atheist. But he said, you can't really have that kind of a world in which we're protected from anything going wrong. Because it would mean that the laws of nature couldn't obtain. Every time an airplane would take off, and with 300 people on board, and it looks like it's going to crash, God would have to save it. Work a miracle. Don't let it crash. People are going to get hurt. And of course, what do you do with the laws of gravity then? In fact, what do you do with all the laws of physics which entail planes crashing? God would have to be working miracles all the time to stop the laws of nature from resulting in bad things happening. So if God is going to make a world in which things operate according to natural physical laws, it is part of that if a rock rolls down a hill and hits us in the head, we get hit. It goes with the territory. That doesn't deny things like divine providence, but it does mean that the very nature of a physical world is such that physical beings are subject to corruption and the possibility of accidental damage, death, pain, what have you. That's one response. Another point to consider is we presume that man is somehow the first actor on the scene with free will. We don't know that. If you follow biblical Revelation, we're told that an angelic order existed before we did. They might have messed things up. In fact, they might still be messing things up, somewhat diabolically. And consider this too. God makes a world that's perfect. But what happens if a free agent starts to do something that's a bit out of tune? Imagine an orchestra. What happens if you got somebody in the woodwinds who starts playing off key? Of course, the director goes bang, 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 says stop. Why? Because he knows that if he doesn't, pretty soon all the woodwinds will be off key. And if they're all off key, the strings will start getting messed up. Now, is it not possible if you had a very high spiritual being, given the hierarchy of nature and the order of nature, if you had a very high spiritual being misuse his freedom, could this not cause a cascading result in the rest of creation? And that's just another consideration. But to me, the more dominant understanding is simply that God has an option. He doesn't have to make a physical world. He doesn't have to make man. Man is a composite of spirit and physical nature. He didn't have to give us a physical nature. We didn't have to be. He could have just made angels and stopped. Could have. But this world in which we live is a possible object of God's creative activity. And in it we find the perfection of human beings. Are we to say, therefore, that God should not have created this world? And if he does create this world, it comes as a package. Rocks do what they do, vegetables do what they do, animals do what they do, and we do what we do. And all of them gloriously interact with each other, for better or for worse. And it's not the end of the story. There's more to this. But these are just some of the considerations that we have to have in addressing the problem of evil. I just want to make sure I'm not missing something here. Okay, that's why I say effects of the misuse of the high spiritual faculty of freedom by high creatures, rational, spiritual, could have wide ramifications throughout the created world. Another thing to consider here, we say that we don't see how this mess that we're living through could possibly work out. You know, what has God got in mind? Well, have you ever gone to a play where you get into the first act and the hero gets killed? Do you get up and curse the playwright and walk out? Maybe you should, but usually it's prudent to wait for the final curtain to see what the author had in mind. We're in the middle of the play. We don't see the outcome. And in a certain sense, what the atheist is saying, you know, if I was God, I could have done better. Isn't that really what he's saying? If I was God, I wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have done that. I could have worked it out a lot better than he did. Okay, what can one say to that? I mean, I'm tempted to say something, but I'll try not to, out of charity. We don't know what God's ultimate intentions are. His ways are inscrutable. All we know is we're in the middle of something. By the way, we do know from metaphysics that God does exist. And we know that he's good, and we know he's all-powerful. And therefore we know that there has to be a solution to the problem of evil. That's why I say you start at the wrong end of this with the evil and without the metaphysical certitudes. And obviously, you're probably never going to get to those metaphysical certitudes. I'd be amazed if you did. But here we are. Could God have made a world with free beings in it? Let's just do a little bit of hypothesizing here. Could he have made a world with free beings in it, in which they all would, well, first of all, if they're free, as I said before, freedom means that if it's real, they've got to be able to misuse their freedom. They've got to be able to choose things they shouldn't choose. And de facto, we know they do, so that clearly is a possibility. So we should not be shocked if they did, and clearly that we have. We got a mess of a world. Not necessarily one escaping divine providence, but it certainly is sticky in the present moment.
Could you say something about how freedom is different in God versus in his creatures? In that for freedom to be real for us, we have to be able to misuse our freedom. But in God, there is no misuse of freedom, but it's still free.
I actually covered that in an earlier class. That God does indeed have freedom with respect to his creatures, not freedom in reference to himself. He operates of necessity, but voluntarily in relation to himself. But as far as whether he makes creatures, that's his option. It doesn't add anything to him or subtract anything to him. From our standpoint, we are by our nature ordered to a last end, which is to attain God himself. We get into problems when we choose finite goods to the exclusion of that last end. And that's where we get into choosing moral evil.
Is it because, is the fact that our intellect is limited as opposed to God's intellect, where difference in will comes into play? Because God knows everything perfectly, so his will is in some sense based on his omniscience.
It's also based on the fact that he is the infinite good and his will is identical to the divine substance. So he truly has no choice except to love himself infinitely. When we're choosing between limited goods, and even some of them that really aren't good because they're disordered in relation to our last end. But that's more ethics. I'm taking it as a fact that we choose evil. Evil exists. Moral evil exists. But could God have made a world in which everybody he created would choose the right things? I mean, we do have a problem. God knows from all eternity what's going to become of us. And therefore, he not only knows that we'll use our freedom, he knows we'll abuse our freedom. And he knows who'll do what, and he'll know who will miss his last end because of the abuse of his freedom. And he makes us anyway. And that, of course, is one of the objections that's sometimes made against God, because they'll say, well, you know, if he knew that I was going to miss my last end, notice I'm avoiding the theology here. If he knew I was going to do that, wasn't it a terrible thing for him to make me? And why couldn't he have just made a world in which everybody attains their last end? He could have. He could have. So why did he create what he did? There's a lot more complexity here we have to address. One of the things that I'd like you to consider for a moment, I think there was an old song, something like There'll Never Be Another You. Anybody know that song? I know the title. I think the subtitle was For Better or Worse. No, I'm just kidding about that. But I just want you to think for a moment. When you love somebody, why do you love them? Why do you love them? If you can give all the reasons for loving them, and we do you love them simply because of the reasons? And do you not sometimes love people even when they disappoint you? Even when they don't live up to those reasons, sometimes you still love them. Because love is a choice. Love is a choice. Why did God make you? Could you be you? Let's say, hypothetically, that you both of your parents were so evil that they had to be electrocuted before you were born. My lawyer friend here is where I went to law school. But you kind of get the point. If your parents were that evil, here's our difficulty. What if God loves you and decides that you shall be, and you shall be with him for all eternity, happily? Could you be you if you were not the child of your parents? See, we've got a little difficulty here. Imagine, this is terribly anthropomorphic, but imagine that God is an old man sitting in his library, and he's got 1,000,000 books around him, and every one of those books represents a complete creation. Some of them have people in it, nothing ever goes wrong. They all choose the right thing. Some of them, maybe they all choose the wrong thing. And some of them, it's a mixed bag. But here's the problem. If God chooses to create you, unique individual that you are, you appear in only one book because you're unique. So if God chooses to create you, he's got to pull that book off the shelf. In other words, he's got to make the creation in which you exist. And in that sense, unless we're going to force God's free will, it is his option as to which world he creates and which beings he chooses to give the option of freedom. Remember, he doesn't make people do the wrong thing. He may permit them to do it, but if you are to exist in this world and to have the option of permanent happiness which God gives to you, and if he is to have the freedom to choose that you exist, this world must exist as a matter of logical necessity. And we can't tell God which world he had to make. Now, that of course comes back to another basic question. Is this the best of all possible worlds? Of course not. Because it's finite. God can always make something better. And no matter what he makes, he could make it better. Because the finite can always be made better. But this is the best possible world for the divine intention. What is his intention? Now, I would suggest that God could have made a world in which we wouldn't be caught in the vicissitudes of choice that we find ourselves. Just imagine if you came out of your house in the morning and you looked across a big field and you saw on the other side of that big field the biggest pair of combat boots you ever saw in your life going right up through the clouds. Would you be good? I think so. In other words, if God's existence were so manifestly evident, if this world was so clear-cut that nobody would dare do anything wrong, surely we would exercise our freedom more judiciously than we do. But God doesn't choose to make that kind of a world. He's made a world in which it is possible even to be an atheist. Oh, heavens to Betsy, I would wish, and I suspect you would too, that God would give us circumstances where we just couldn't screw up. That God would give us a world in which we would be assured of doing the right thing and reaching our last end. But it isn't that way, is it? This is a very difficult world. One in which, as St. Paul says, we work out our salvation in fear and trembling. We live in a world in which it's possible to be an atheist, in which it's possible not even to know the existence of God. God has achieved something which even Geppetto could not do. Geppetto made Pinocchio, and Pinocchio turns around and recognizes it. But God has made the world in such a way that we may not even know that God made us. We are free to even be an atheist. Oh, not that we should, all things being equal. I mean, after all, St. Paul chastises the Romans for not recognizing the existence of God from the things that he has made, which of course is what the Thomistic arguments for God's existence do. And most people recognize that. But on the other hand, we live in a world, a material world, in which it's possible to explain everything, or try to explain everything, in material terms. We have even achieved in this modern age a theory of evolution that allows us to be Darwinists in a strictly material stand or position. Namely, to explain the whole world, as any Darwinian will do for you, without God. The whole thing can be explained without any reference to God. And therefore, no reference to morality, because after all, ultimately there's no basis for morality once you get rid of God. A lot of people dance around and say you can, but that's another issue for ethics. But we live in a world in which it is possible, if we so choose, to live in ignorance of, and deliberately ignoring for that reason, any higher order, any architect of our being to whom we are responsible. Now, in such a world, we don't have to be morally good. And it's very easy to be morally bad. Indeed, if we want to be good, if we want to achieve the greatest perfection of our nature, we have to choose it. And we have to choose it in the face of skepticism and doubt and atheism, which is broadcast in a secular world that's getting more secular all the time. We may prefer personally that it not be that way. It would be much safer for us if, we were on the straight and narrow, everybody acknowledged the existence of God, we knew what was right, and it was easy to do what was right. But that isn't the world we live in. God has permitted us to be in a world in which it is indeed difficult to lead a really virtuous life. But the other side of the coin is that if you do choose to lead a virtuous life, it is therefore of much greater value. It would seem God values quality over quantity. There might be more people who could stay on the straight and narrow if we were operated like God, as if God were the great puppet master. But he doesn't choose to make it that way. We live in a world in which it is the best of all possible worlds for the perfection and the production of the greatest saints. Not necessarily the greatest number of them. This makes the world in which we find ourselves makes more sense, I think, than any other explanation. Because it not only explains how good and evil can exist in the world, but it also gives us some understanding of why a world in which there is so much manifest evil still serves the divine purpose. Now again, there are many other aspects to the problem of evil. I don't know if you have, and you probably have thought of some questions. If you got them, go ahead and throw them at me right now, because right offhand, I'm not sure where else one could go with the topic.
Is it possible that he did it this way because otherwise he would not have beings for which he would be their end? If everything was automatic like for animals, animals don't really have God as their end.
I think the general position of philosophers addressing that issue would be that if man did not exist, God would not have made the lower creatures. because they are ordered to man as the highest perfection of the natural order. It would not make sense, in other words, to just have a bunch of planets floating around doing nothing. That doesn't mean there aren't planets out there teeming with animals, but we're in a universe in which we exist. This is the only place in the universe where we're sure that even life exists. But we are sure that on this planet, intelligent, spiritual life exists, and therefore the argument would be that the entire creation, in a very real sense, centers on the kind of being that we are. That's why this whole business about Galileo upsetting the whole universe, because suddenly we discovered man was not the center of the universe. Man is always the center of the universe, no matter where he is in the galaxies or the cosmos, because he is metaphysically and ontologically superior to any natural physical entity, and therefore the center of all things, qualitatively speaking. But it can well be argued that God would simply not have made the universe if it were not for this kind of being. God, indeed, could have just been by himself. He didn't have to create anything. Or he could have just created an angelic order, purely spiritual beings. But we were at least a logical possibility, something within the divine nature that could be realized as a creature, and God freely chose to make us. That would be one of his free acts. He didn't have to do it. We don't add anything to God. Qualitatively, every perfection found in us preeminently exists in God because he is causing it. And
What I was meant was, if we didn't have the ability to choose, would we really be able to be beings for which God is our end? We were automatically always good. I mean, even the angels apparently had to make a choice.
well, if you say automatically, then
If we were always good.
Free.
There was no evil. We weren't capable of evil.
well, you say not capable. If you're not capable of it, what kind of freedom do you have?
Well, what I mean is, if God had created us that way, is it possible that we would not have God as our end? If
You
we were always
can't,
good?
I don't think you could say that God could create a free being that is not free. If he's
No, I'm saying we wouldn't be free.
well, then we
were
wouldn't
always
be,
good.
We wouldn't be human. To be human, to be a person, is to be a supposit of a rational nature, and any substance of a rational nature is by definition not only intellective but also free, has a will. And if you actually have a will, you have to be able to exercise it. And if you are able to exercise it, you can misuse it, as we've so gloriously seen. So it's not a metaphysical possibility to make non-free spiritual beings, if that's what you're getting at. You can't do that.
Well, would that be the reason why he made us free, so that we could have God as our end?
He made us free because he made us spiritual. He made us persons. Any person is both intellective and volitional. Can't be helped. Be like a square circle otherwise. So if God's going to make persons which have their last end in him, they also are going to be free beings. When I talk about a universe in which everybody happens to do the right thing, it would be happens to do, not had to do. Not that they could not do otherwise, but they just happen to all choose the proper last end. Conceivably, there could be such a universe. We're not in it. God, as far as we know, didn't make it. But if they did do it, they would have done so by free choice. It wouldn't be because God made a kind of being that just automatically had to go to him as his last end. Anybody else here? I know there's more to this.
Do you think it's the media and television that kind of reduces everybody's logic and thinking so much that they just can't get their head around this? I mean, all these problems, like the big issue now is same-sex marriage, and the intimacy is good and everybody should have it, and so the logic works in a little tin can, which is about all it is. It leaves so much out.
Well, that's why I said if you start from the wrong end of the stick, you're not going to see the possibility of solving the problem of evil. And that's why all these internet websites that protesting atheism are all about the problem of evil. That's all they can see. And to begin to understand how evil is possible, you have to first of all have that metaphysical framework of knowing, yeah, we can demonstrate God exists and that he is all-powerful and is all good. Now we look at the mystery of the world he's created and try to understand it. It's not an immediate logical impossibility that evil exists and God exists and be all good and all-powerful. What they're doing is they're looking at the nature of the evil in the world and making an argument that somehow this trips up either God's power or his goodness. And in a sense, the burden of proof then belongs to the atheist to show how it happens. All that we have to do is to give a possible explanation of why it's not inconsistent with the goodness and the power of God. And that's why we look at a number of these considerations. Maybe animals don't feel anything. I don't say I believe that, but that's one possible way out of it. It's on the part of the atheist, he's got to show that it's impossible that God exist and be good and all-powerful, given that evil exists. We're not going to duck it by saying evil isn't real, but you've got to understand evil is it's a perversion of nature. What God makes is good, because God makes things according to his intention. The nature is a reified intention. In other words, it's his intention put into reality. And the sense in which something is evil is because it fails to live up to that. If I have a disease, then that I don't have the state of health. If I have pain in the disease, the pain in part is telling me I've got the disease and should be doing something about it. So it serves a purpose. But it doesn't mean that God intended in the first place of creating me that I should have pain. But pain goes with the territory. As far as animals are concerned, I think one would have to say that the nature is such that it is subject to the possibility of pain, but pain serves a greater good. Remember, the alternative is that the animal not exist, or that animals not exist. And don't forget, if the lower is subordinated to the higher, we need the inorganic, we need the vegetative, we need the animal in order to prepare the way for man. And the great dynamic, the great reality of evil is not physical evil, but moral evil. Moral good and moral evil, which means the whole problem of evil has to focus on the moral dimension of these spiritual beings, such as we are, or perhaps some other order consists of, such as the angelic.
If you were a true Darwinian, wouldn't that actually eliminate moral evil? Wouldn't it make all moral evils of kind of physical evil?
It wouldn't even be that. I do not see logically how a Darwinian can defend the existence of moral evil.
Right, it would seem like a contradiction.
Nothing is more evil. I mean, if a dog bites you, there's nothing morally evil about it. You don't say, you reprehensible cur, how could you do that to me?
Right.
And by similar logic, from the Darwinian standpoint, somebody like B.F. Skinner would suggest we really don't have any freedom, and therefore we're not responsible for anything we do. And we should just, if somebody bites you, you should be as benign in your attitude towards them as you would towards the dog. I think the Darwinian would have to say, well, we might have to put the dog out of its existence, but we don't condemn him for being a dog that bites. It's just it's inconvenient to have him around, and they might say, well, you execute a human being that runs around shooting people for the same reason, but you can't logically condemn them. The real notion of morality is that you are responsible, that you can be guilty and should be ashamed of what you do. I see no logic in Darwinism for having those attitudes. Anything else? Okay, I guess we'll terminate.